Dr. St-Onge. Welcome to Deep Into Sleep podcast.
Hi, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. So great to have you. So I'm curious, want to ask you, how did you get in the field to do some research on, the relationship between diet, nutrition, and sleep? What got you interested in it?
Yeah, so it was actually quite serendipitous. My PhD is in nutrition. So I received a PhD in nutrition from McGill University. And I was very interested in energy balance and the impact of various foods on energy balance regulation. So making small alterations to your diet that could improve um, energy expenditure to help potentially reduce body weight and lead to negative energy balance. And I was on this path, looking at studying functional foods to improve energy expenditure, increase thermic effect of food. And while I was at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, this was my first faculty position, the NIH came out with a call for applications, and the title of it was Sleep and Energy Balance.
Oh,
But it hadn't come to me. I hadn't seen this request for applications, but the sleep researchers at the institution had. So they came to the Department of Nutrition and had a meeting with myself and another of my colleagues to know about energy balance. What is this? How do we measure energy balance? Could we respond to this RFA? And I was a junior faculty member. I think it was in my second year as assistant professor. And I thought, wow, that's kind of an interesting topic. I don't know so much about sleep, but we could certainly look at energy balance in the context of sleep duration. My colleague who was with me at the time was more senior, and she was well established in her field. And at the end of the meeting, she told me, said, this sleep thing, if you want to go for it and work with these researchers, go right ahead. It's not something I want to pursue. Sure. So, okay. So I started working with them. We put in an application. It didn't get funded. I ultimately switched institutions, but kept working on this. I had done all this, writing, and I was getting very interested in sleep. And I was actually at a time where I was pregnant, and I was pregnant with twins while I was writing this grant. And I thought, how odd that I'm so sleep deprived while I'm pregnant, and I'm working on this grant application looking at how reduced sleep, insufficient sleep can influence energy balance regulation. But anyways, long story short, after a few iterations of grant applications, I finally got funded to run a study that was a sleep restriction study, a very short-term acute severe sleep restriction, to assess how that would influence energy balance. And we had energy expenditure assessments and measurements of food intake and appetite regulating hormones. We also looked at functional neuroimaging and really had a holistic picture of how restricting sleep in people could influence their food choices and their energy expenditure.
oh, wow. That sounds like such a pioneering and important field to really study,
Well, it
right?
was important because at the time we had a lot of emerging studies showing that, from observational epidemiological studies, that individuals who had short sleep also tended to have more obesity, have higher body mass index. But those epidemiological studies were really showing associations and not necessarily causation. And early work from Yves Kauter's lab had shown that restricting sleep in young men, young healthy men, led to greater feelings of appetite. And these men reported feeling more hungry, feeling less satiated after undergoing a sleep restriction. And she had also measured leptin and ghrelin and had shown that ghrelin, which is an appetite hormone, a hormone that signals food intake, was higher after sleep restriction compared to adequate sleep condition. But they hadn't measured food intake in that study, and it was a very short-term study with only men. And our study then had a larger sample size, more participants, including women, and was slightly longer in duration, measured more appetite regulating hormones, and actually measured food intake in the lab, so we could actually quantify the the extra food intake of participants in short sleep conditions,
Wow.
really showing a causal influence of restricting sleep on food intake.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was just about to ask what were the causation like finding you guys find. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so in this study, had participants under controlled feeding conditions for 4 days. Uh, Controlled feeding conditions for 4 days in the context of sleep restriction and in the context of adequate sleep. And that was the time period where we actually took hormone measurements and really looked at different metabolites. And when we were done with our metabolic assessments, we let our participants self-select their food intake over one day and measured everything they ate in the lab. So they were under inpatient conditions. So a few things came out from this study. Um, One, it was very important to me that we did this study under controlled feeding conditions when we were taking metabolic assessments, because changes in participants' food intake could influence appetite regulating hormones. If they eat more in one condition, then there's counter-regulatory effects.
Hmm.
So we wanted to make sure that in both conditions they'd be eating the exact same amount of food when we were taking our metabolic assessments. But then we also wanted to know, like, are they going to eat more, right?
Mhm.
So the good thing was that we had a large number, relatively large number of males and females, and when we looked at appetite regulating hormones, we saw in the group as a whole there was no effect on leptin and ghrelin. But when we looked at data for men and women separately, we found that ghrelin was increased in men, but not in women. But we also had measurements of another hormone called glucagon-like peptide 1, which is a hormone that signals satiety, so stopping eating. And with that hormone, we found that in women, but not in men, there was a reduction in glucagon-like peptide 1. So there is less satiety signal in women undergoing sleep restriction, but whereas in men, there was more signaling to eat. So higher ghrelin in men and lower GLP-1 in women in the context of sleep restriction. When we let our participants self-select their food intake, they ate almost 300 calories more in sleep restriction compared to adequate sleep conditions.
Wow. So it
Yeah.
sounds like if we don't sleep well, we tend to feel more like a stronger hunger and
Mhm.
tend to choose to eat more and possibly eat unhealthy.
Yeah, they tended to eat more fat and saturated fat in our study, but others have also found similar findings, that there's an increase in food intake in participants who are undergoing sleep restriction. And in some studies, one study in particular, participants chose more snack foods or chose more sugar sweetened foods, more refined carbohydrates. So in general, I think that studies agree that if you're restricting your sleep, you're not making the healthiest food choices.
Right. Then I'm wondering, nowadays our life is so busy. A lot of people don't prioritize their sleep, right? So if for whatever reason people are not sleeping well, they are restricting their own sleep somewhat. Is there a way that they can learn to choose their food more cautiously to
Mhm.
help with their energy level during the day?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because you're talking about energy level during the day, right? So when we're feeling sleepy, we often feel tired. We feel like we need more energy to perk yourself up, right? Which is what happens when you eat food, you get energy, you perk up. Um, so that's, I think, one of the things that happens when you're undergoing short sleep and you're feeling sleepy, is you tend to crave foods to give you this little perk. Um, but we also, in a separate study, measured energy expenditure
Mm.
because we were wondering what would happen with with energy expenditure in our participants. Would they burn more energy? Would they burn less energy? And we did a study in a metabolic chamber. So this is a room that's about, basically the size of my office. And you live in this room for 24 hours, and we measure energy expenditure every single minute. And
Wow.
what we found in that study was that energy expenditure during wake time was not different at all, whether you slept 4 hours the night before or whether you slept 8 hours the night before. During the daytime, your energy expenditure was exactly the same. But if we had in one condition participants sleep 4 hours, and in another condition they slept 8 hours, when participants went to bed, which was earlier, obviously, in the 8 hour sleep condition, their energy expenditure was reduced compared to the 4 hour sleep condition. And when participants woke up, their energy expenditure was the same again, right? So wake time energy expenditure was the same, sleep time energy expenditure was also the same. But because wake time energy expenditure is higher than sleeping energy expenditure, and when you're sleep restricting yourself, you're actually burning more calories. So in a way, you need more energy on days that you sleep less because you're burning more just to maintain wakefulness. But the extent of the increase in energy expenditure was about 90 calories, about 5% of total, 5 to 7% of total energy expenditure. So it wasn't that much.
Hey.
Definitely not to the extent of the overeating that we had observed in the prior study. So then basically what it means is if you're sleep restricting yourself, then you tend to eat more, you overcompensate for the energy expenditure, the extra energy expenditure that you burn.
Oh, it's so interesting because I treat insomnia mostly. We always notice there's a gap between, subjective like perspectives and how like objectively the data looks like for sleep overall. But sounds like for energy level, for like diet behaviors, there is some gap between what's really happening versus what we perceive that is
Mm-hmm.
happening.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow, and that guides our brain to lead to very unhealthy food choices. Wow, that's so interesting. I never know that.
Well, the other thing that we did, and that's in the first sleep restriction study, was do functional neuroimaging.
Mm.
And we showed participants pictures of foods and pictures of objects, and we looked at their neuronal responses to those different images. And we found that the brain regions that were associated with reward system were upregulated in a short sleep condition compared to the adequate sleep condition. So really what we seemed to find was if you're restricting sleep in people, they have a hormonal profile that predisposes to overeating, so more appetite signaling or less satiety signaling in short sleep compared to adequate sleep. But then also their brains are more attuned to rewarding properties of foods and may find foods more appealing. So taken together, then that kind of explains how someone could easily overeat under conditions of short sleep compared to adequate sleep.
Right.
And also, again, the energy expenditure study that I was mentioning was in a metabolic chamber,
Mm,
which in which you really can't move so much. So
mm.
that, I'm saying that in that study we found more energy expenditure, right, in short sleep compared to adequate sleep. But we don't know if that extra energy expenditure could be offset by just lifestyle energy expenditure choices. If you're feeling tired, would you choose to take the elevator rather than the stairs? If you go for a run, do you run slower? Would you choose not to go for a run and then just like sit on the couch and watch TV instead of exercising because you're feeling too tired? So maybe, there's an extra energy is being burned to maintain wakefulness, but that's compensated by more sedentary behaviors just because you don't feel like exercising because you're too tired. That's something that we haven't really been able to capture very well in our studies, but others have shown that under conditions of sleep restriction, if they have participants in an outpatient facility, for example, compared to an inpatient facility, participants tend to have fewer activity counts and more sedentary behavior when they're undergoing short sleep.
Yeah, that's also interesting because that remind me when we treat insomnia patients. I think that totally makes sense. Why we see so many patients, they come in, they said they did not sleep well, right?
Hmm.
They could not get enough sleep. Sometimes it's for short sleep, sometimes it's because insomnia. And then they tend to feel really the symptom of fatigue during the day. And a lot of people do choose to rest in order to feel better. So they
Hmm.
think they're gonna feel better, but what we notice if they are more quiet, they are just relaxed more during the day, their insomnia gonna get worse at night.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sometimes we ask people to, move around, move their body, or do whatever they normally do. Don't stop exercising or socializing. If they really do that, some of them do experience their energy level comes back again. So I'm curious, like how to understand that. You may not have the answer, but just from the study, I'm just curious, where that extra energy, right, come from?
Yeah, it also has to do with motivation, right? How motivated are you when you're feeling too tired and fatigued? And that's just, you're talking to me about insomnia, and that's something that we've been kind of wondering about. What happens in insomnia treatment when sleep restriction is part of the intervention? Do we know what happens to participants' food intake, their energy expenditure, their energy balance during that period? And how long of a stretch is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. At least from the patients I treat mostly Asian patients. So I always just check basically, do they eat regularly, right?
Hmm.
And most Chinese, I know they eat at a certain time each day. They eat certain amount of food, mostly Chinese food. So a lot of my patients throughout the insomnia treatment course, they do not change much. At least they don't report much like eating pattern change. They
Mm.
always think their eating pattern are still regular. Still, sometimes they are not the one cooking the food and they just keep whatever the diet it is. But I don't
Hmm.
know whether in the process they actually crave or actually have more snacks, right?
Yeah.
I have no idea. But for the sleep restriction technique, a lot of time we only do it for 1 to 2 weeks.
Okay.
And also, I remember clinically there are some guidance to say don't restrict to less than 5 hours per night.
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
not that extreme. And for a lot of insomnia patients, that's exactly the gap between the perception and the reality.
Okay.
So many of them, they within that several weeks of treatment, their body actually cannot generate too many sleep anyway. So that's why sleep restriction is try to reduce to a point that, similar to what they are able to fall asleep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So their time in bed matches their actual sleep duration, as opposed
Uh-huh.
to just lying there. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't know how that is related to, other type of sleep restriction or
Hmm.
deprivation or short sleep.
Yeah, so that's the other thing, with our research, we usually always, well, we always um, enroll participants who have adequate sleep, because it would really not be ethical to restrict sleep in people who are already sleeping too little, right? So we take people who sleep at least 7 hours per night, and then we restrict their sleep. That study that I was talking about was a very strictly controlled inpatient study, but now we've taken this to a longer duration um, where we're asking participants to restrict their sleep by an hour and a half. So they just reduce their sleep by an hour and a half and maintain that for 6 weeks
Mm.
as an outpatient study.
Oh,
And so
wow.
we're working on the data now. And yeah, just stay tuned where we've got a whole bunch of papers lined up on multiple outcomes that we've taken in that study.
Oh, that would be amazing. I would love to, let me know when the paper is out. I would love to read those and refer to those to some of the patients. I think they possibly can really benefit some of the most updated research results. But also, it's very interesting because if those participants normally they sleep certain hours, right?
Hmm.
And when you restrict them, there's going to be a big change in their sleep routine
Hmm.
and how that's going to be different than already clinically clinical patients with insomnia. They already cannot sleep much, and you
Hmm.
restrict them just to basically let them not stay on bed when they are awake too much. So
Right.
that'd be different. I don't know. That's so interesting.
Yeah. So in our study, we asked our participants to delay their bedtimes by an hour and a half, kind of mimic people who just stay up late at night, but they have to wake up at the same time.
Hmm. Wow, it's going to be a hard study. If I'm the participant for 6 weeks, I was like, whoa.
6 weeks. Yeah. So the other good thing is that we're conducting this in New York City, and most people don't drive.
Ah,
And we asked our participants, we had them sign on the consent form that they would not drive during the study, which is easy to do. Most people who are, local take the subway everywhere or walk, take the bus, take public transport. So that was a stipulation in the study that you wouldn't drive under conditions of sleep restriction
yeah. Yeah, so
for
it sounds
for participant safety for sure,
definitely,
and in
definitely.
general population safety.
When we treat insomnia patients, the same thing, right? Within 1 to 2 weeks of restriction, we ask them try not to drive, be careful, and
Hmm.
really safety first.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah, so sounds like, nutrition is part of the thing in the picture. But
Hmm.
really, if you want to enjoy your energy and have a good energy balancing throughout the day, sleep still very important. Sounds like just by eating, right? You really won't be able to boost your energy that much as we often see in different advertisement.
Yes. So yeah, you need a balance of all three, lifestyle factors I think are very important when we talk about diet, sleep, exercise.
Mhm.
All three are important to influence one another,
Yeah.
right? So if you have healthy sleep, you have more energy to exercise, you make healthier dietary choices. There was a paper just this spring, right? A sleep extension study by Dr. Tasali showing that if you're extending sleep in people who don't sleep enough, they lose weight, right? They lost a half a kilo over a 4 week period, and they I would assume then make better food choices for better
Yeah.
diet choices for themselves.
That's so amazing. Oh, in the past, we never really hear much the association between weight loss and sleep. We always hear people talk about, well, diet, exercise if you want to lose weight, right?
Mhm.
But recent years, I think more and more I start hearing from different doctors, nutritionists, dietitians, more about sleep can
Yes.
really help with weight control.
Yeah, so there was such an elegant study by Arlet Neocheva published, I think it was 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. It was a small sample, but they took participants and had them undergo a weight loss diet. They gave them all of the food to lose weight for 2 weeks, and in one condition had them sleep adequately, so they slept over 7.5 hours or so, and in the other condition they slept about 5.5 hours, and they measured their weight loss. But this was under controlled feeding conditions. These participants ate the same thing, whether they were sleeping little or sleeping adequately. So obviously, if they were given all their food, they lost weight. They lost same amount of weight in both conditions, right? Whether they were sleep restricted or not, they lost the same amount of weight. But they looked at the composition of weight loss, and under the sleep restricted condition, they lost less fat mass and more fat free mass than when they were undergoing adequate sleep with the weight loss program. They also measured their resting metabolic rate, and they found that their resting metabolic rate was reduced to a greater extent when they were undergoing short sleep restriction compared to adequate sleep. And their respiratory quotient, which is an indication of the types of macronutrients that you're burning, so whether you're burning more fat or more carbohydrates, that respiratory quotient was also higher when they were undergoing sleep restriction compared to adequate sleep. So a higher respiratory quotient means that you're burning more carbohydrates and less fat. When you're undergoing weight loss, what do you want to burn? You want to burn more fat. You want to lose more fat mass. You don't want to lose fat-free mass. So basically, even though the weight loss was the same, the composition of the weight loss and the metabolic effects of the weight loss differed in such a way that when participants stop a weight loss program, they go back to eating a little more, right? But if your metabolic rate is reduced to a greater extent, then that creates a situation where it's more likely to regain weight in the sleep restricted condition compared to the adequate sleep condition.
Wow. So can we understand that this way, that if you sleep enough and then you are losing weight in a more healthy way, and more likely you're gonna keep this healthy weight like longer term, less relapse.
So they didn't look at after the fact, right? So we only know what happens after, at the end of that 2-week weight loss period. But one could expect that this would be the case. It needs to be measured in other studies where you actually look at, weight loss maintenance.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I never really think that way, that you don't just look at how many pounds got reduced. You actually should look what's really the details, the components within that.
Absolutely. You don't want to lose metabolically active tissue. You want to lose the more inert kind of tissue.
Yeah, sounds even possibly going to be harmful to the body by losing, the tissues you don't want to lose.
Well, it's especially important when we're talking about older adults, in whom we don't really want loss of fat-free mass. It's harder to rebuild lean mass in older adults.
Yeah, right. So that touch on a population question. I don't know whether you still have time for
Sure.
some of those questions, because I'm curious when you mentioned your own experience, for example, when you were pregnant with a twin, right? That's great. Congratulations. But I'm curious, have you noticed any research or your own research showing, what different populations should pay attention differently, like a woman in pregnancy, or, woman in was that the menopause phase, or older adults, or younger children? Is there anything really stand out for a specific population that our audience should pay attention to?
Yeah, so there's certainly different sleep conditions occur throughout life, right? So during pregnancy, obviously, sleep can be influenced just by the weight gain, right? And just being uncomfortable during sleep. A lot of women feel congested and have harder time breathing through their nose. Some women develop sleep apnea during pregnancy. So those are all things that need to be considered. I I think it was also quite important to try to achieve good sleep during pregnancy, but it's not so easy always. And then the postpartum period, when you have the babies, it can be hard to sleep as well, and you fall into these periods of better and not so good sleep. But I think in each life stage, it's important to try to maintain as healthy sleep as possible, um, either through trying to maintain stable sleep routines, which I think are quite important. And we're learning a lot more about stability and regularity of sleep. Um, but obviously, each life stage brings its own challenges, for sure.
Right, right. Yeah. So I think, again, feels like sleep is a very individualized thing, right? And the diet is too.
Hmm.
So I think we really should pay attention to where our body is and what life stage we are, and find out what's the best for each of us.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. That's great. Very great information. Thank you for sharing all this wonderful research with us. I learned a lot. A lot of
Thank
research I'm not familiar with, but really cool.
Oh, thank you so much. It was great. It was really nice chatting with you.